Good morning, everybody. Good morning. How's everyone doing? Hopefully people are staying a little warm, trying to be at least. So my name is Kate Whittles. I'm a partner at HRNA Advisors. We're a real estate and economic development consulting firm headquartered here in New York. We love parks. We work on about 300 parks a year. But today I'm here as a proud board member of the Center for Urban Future. And one of the things I love most about CUF is that it does a great job of raising the visibility of really critical and urgent challenges and opportunities that are facing our city, but also putting forward innovative and actionable policy ideas to make New York City better. CUF has done this for a variety of important but often overlooked issues, from our public libraries to CUNY and to New York City's parks. In 2018, CUF put out a report, A New Leaf, which provided a new level of detail about the infrastructure and maintenance challenges facing so many of our parks. And it played a critical role in increasing funding for maintenance to about $43 million, which is fabulous. Since that time, parks have become even more vital to New Yorkers' health, and with a lot more people using parks, maintenance needs have escalated. But for years, if not decades, New York City has struggled to provide sufficient funding for our parks. And at HRNA, we know that this is not just a New York City problem, this is a problem across the country that parks are facing. Today, more than ever, parks are being asked to make tough choices about how to do more programming with fewer resources, while visitorship and experience expectations continue to increase. At the same time, parks create a remarkable amount of financial and social benefits, being as essential to urban life as public transit, maybe even more so. Last year, to help solve this chronic funding shortfall, CUF published a report that put out 20 creative ideas for generating new revenue streams to fund the city's growing park needs. There were a lot of great ideas in that report, and I encourage you all to read it. I'm excited for today's event, which will zoom in on one of them, providing a modest surcharge on tickets sold at stadiums, arenas, and concert venues to generate dedicated recurring revenue for park maintenance. Before we move forward and hear from our fabulous panelists, I want to take a moment to thank our funder, the City Parks Foundation's NYC Green Fund. Without their support, we would not be here today. And we really want to also thank our speakers here today and all they do for supporting New York City parks. And with that, I'd like to introduce and hand this over to CUF's Executive Director, Jonathan Bowles.
Good morning. All right. Well, thanks so much, Kate. That was great. And thank you to the City Parks Foundation's NYC Green Fund. It's great to see all of you here on such a nice warm morning. As Kate said, I'm Jonathan Bowles. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Urban Future. I know that we have over 100 folks joining us online too, so welcome and thanks for joining us there as well. As Kate mentioned, today's forum focuses on the idea of implementing a modest ticket surcharge to help fund parks maintenance needs. A new report we published just last week details exactly what our proposed ticket surcharge would entail, or rather, it includes a few different options for how New York might set up a ticket surcharge, because there are a lot of different ways this could work. The ticket surcharge is one of 20 ideas we put forward last year to create new dedicated revenue streams for parks and open spaces. In a couple of months, we are going to be releasing new research about another idea from that 2024 report, specifically about the opportunity to initiate a modest expansion of restaurants, cafes, and other concessions in parks that enhance the visitor experience while also generating funding for parks. Now, there are a lot of reasons we think a ticket surcharge especially makes sense. Today's discussion will delve into some of those reasons, and we'll also hear from our great panelists to think about how we can make sure that this proposal becomes reality, and if there are any things we could do to actually make it an even better proposal. Now, I have to say, all of us at CUF do follow the news. So we know that with all the post-election attention on pocketbook issues, there may not be a huge appetite among policymakers right now to ask New Yorkers to pay more for anything, even a 1% surcharge on a $120 ticket. But it's also a good bet that New York is going to need new revenue options in the not too distant future, especially if, as expected, New York sees less money coming in from Washington over the next several years. In about 10 minutes, we're going to have a discussion with an amazing group of panelists to talk through the ticket surcharge idea, with plenty of time at the end for questions and comments. But now I'd like to bring up the two authors of CUF's ticket surcharge report so they can tell you a little more about our idea. So please join me in welcoming Eli Dvorkin, CUF's editorial and policy director, and John Sirico, CUF's senior fellow for climate and opportunity. Get to the panel soon, but could I just also have another hand for John and Eli? They do such great work. And a big thanks to the rest of the CUF team that does such great work. You know, we do a lot of work. I think a lot of people see the reports we publish. We have 7 people on staff at CUF, and the work that we kind of get out there would not be possible with such fantastic people. So thank you. So let's talk about a ticket surcharge. This was something that you just wrote about a week ago that we published. So let me start with Eli. What exactly do we mean by a ticket surcharge to benefit parks? Exactly what is CUF proposing, and why?
Yeah, thanks, John. So thanks everybody for being here today. So we're proposing a modest surcharge on top of the face price of a ticket to Major League Sporting events. That would be the biggest driver of revenue. To events in Broadway, for instance, large theaters and concert venues. And we're talking about a surcharge that would be less than the New York City portion of sales tax, maybe a lot less, like 1%. We also lay out options at 3% and 5%. The potential for revenue is pretty significant, despite the relatively modest surcharge. You know, the average concert ticket in New York City, or event ticket rather, is $120, thereabouts. So we're talking about 1%, $1.20 on a $120 ticket. Something that I think most ticket buyers wouldn't even really notice, although they would see that this is to fund the NYC Parks Improvement Fund. It would be very clearly laid out what that surcharge is for. We can talk about how that would work in a sec. And we're talking about significant revenue. At 1%, about $38 million in annual recurring revenue, which would be enough to fund many of the hundreds of staff positions in parks that have actually been lost to attrition and budget cuts over the years. These are the folks that are the gardeners, the masons, the plumbers, the electricians, the day-to-day maintenance workers in our parks. And I think every New Yorker would see the benefits of that kind of infusion of funding.
And why a surcharge on tickets?
Well, you know, that's a great question because it actually gets at why we started with this idea in the first place. You know, so I mentioned that the biggest portion of that revenue would come from events, Major League Sporting events. And we started with this idea because many of those events take place on what is actually parkland. It's owned by you and me and every other New Yorker. Events at Yankee Stadium and Citi Field, at the U.S. Tennis Center in Flushing Meadows, the Brooklyn Cyclones as well, for that matter. But those events, you know, at Yankee Stadium and Citi Field in particular, they are generating millions of dollars in revenue. Those facilities, however, pay almost nothing back into parks. Now, they do have lease agreements with the City of New York, and they do pay money into the city's general fund, but those facilities, which are actually on parkland, aren't benefiting parks, and then by extension, they aren't benefiting the millions and millions and millions of New Yorkers who use parks every day. So right away, we actually found that over $10 million in that potential for revenue of just 1% would actually come from facilities that are on parkland. And we thought that was a pretty good starting point for this idea. As we kind of progressed the idea, we thought we want to put out some options that could potentially generate more revenue, and there's options there for policymakers, knowing that there's a whole lot more need out there than just 10 or 12 or $13 million in annual revenue. And that's why we decided, look, let's put out what it would look like as a surcharge across the board on major event tickets, and showing some options for policymakers in terms of how much revenue this could actually produce.
And I'm just going to say ask one more question of Eli, then I'm going to bring you in, John. But there's different ways to cut this, right? And so can you give me a sense, Eli, of just okay, when we crunch the numbers here, what's the kind of top revenue that we found that we could bring in potentially? But then also, what's an option for a smaller kind of surcharge, for instance?
Exactly. So, I mean, a 5% surcharge, which is about the same as New York City sales tax, would be about $190 million a year if we included all of those different categories of tickets. Again, the biggest chunk, no matter how you slice it, would be coming from Major League Sporting events, but that would also include Broadway and large concerts. By comparison, if we just focused the surcharge, if it was 1%, you're looking at $38 million a year. If it just focused on the facilities that are actually on parkland, it would be maybe $12 or $13 million a year. So there's sort of a range of options there. And I would also mention that we would look at the secondary market as well, the reseller platforms. And just to be clear, the largest chunk of this revenue is really coming from the most expensive tickets. So when you look at kind of what would be included in the resale market, you're talking about the $2,000 that somebody might spend to see, Billy Joel at the Garden. They didn't get in line and get the tickets when they went on sale. But that would be actually the biggest chunk of these revenues in total are from those very high dollar tickets.
Thanks, Eli. And John, first of all, John did almost all of the research on this, so great job with all of that, John. One of the things I found super interesting about the report is that other cities have done a similar ticket charge. Can you walk us through a few examples of other places that have done this?
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for being here. The thing that always kind of interests me so much with this topic is that New York City actually has really innovative funding models for parks, for individual parks. So we have Brooklyn Bridge Park, which captures windfalls from the developments that are on Brooklyn Bridge Park to pay for operations. You have the bid model with Bryant Park. You have, concessions for Hudson River Park and for Madison Square Park with the Shake Shack there. We also have seen a much more kind of bigger rise recently in privately developed parks like Domino Park in Williamsburg, made by Two Trees Management. What we're lacking is a model for the 1,700 other parks that exist in this city. We do not have a systemic mechanism to fund parks in the city. And actually, on a national scale, we actually have fallen quite far behind. Most cities have figured out a way to kind of capture revenue and dedicate it to parks. The cities that immediately come to mind, that are kind of top of the list in kind of the parks research world, are Chicago and Minneapolis, which have a citywide parks district that everyone pays into through taxes. Seattle just recently joined them. Austin and Toronto and a few other cities, Lexington, Kentucky, just recently joined this list, have what's known as a parkland ordinance, where developers have to pay into a pot when they build or build a new park entirely. And then when we kind of looked at the case studies for our particular idea, one that we looked at was Atlanta, which is doing a lot of different innovative funding right now, and they have a trust that captures all these different revenues from ground leases, as Eli mentioned. The Beltline has a tax district that's been developed around it, so all these new kind of multifamily units being built around the Beltline, which is this brand new park in Atlanta, have to pay into it, and that trust is dedicated to parks maintenance. And in terms of a surcharge, we looked at two specific cities as well. Denver, the famous Red Rocks Amphitheater, 75 cents on every ticket at Red Rocks. Red Rocks is on parkland, it's on Denver Parks parkland, goes to the Denver Parks and Rec Department. But kind of most notably was Columbus, Ohio, which has an arts and culture ticket fee. And that funds two things. That funds stipends for small artists in the city, kind of up-and-coming artists, and also goes to capital projects to renovate the venues in Columbus and make sure that they're thriving for years to come. This last year raised about $10 million in Columbus. Atlanta has about that Parks Trust I mentioned, $36 million. I mean, you got to think about these cities versus New York. But when they made those rules, they thought of a lot of things when, they went through the rulemaking process. The Red Rocks fee has actually been on the books for many years now. It doesn't include, it's kind of thinking of the big shows, the Eras Tour, Beyonce, the kind of big shows at Red Rocks. Your kind of like yoga classes at Red Rocks don't apply here. Similarly to Columbus, they thought about the small bars that have shows, they're kind of exempt here. The University of Ohio, which is in Columbus, is exempt as well. But they also really focused on ticket resellers and all these other ways that money is being generated here. So they went through this process. And I think the last thing I'll kind of note here is that cities are recognizing that in the kind of wake of the pandemic, parks are vital for their livability. They're vital if cities really want to attract people, they have to have a thriving park system. I think they're recognizing increasingly that they have to be funded properly.
Thanks, John. And you've told me also, there are a couple things in New York where we're doing this kind of thing, right? Can you mention that?
Yes. So we have very piecemeal ticket surcharges that go to parks in New York. Celebrate Brooklyn helps fund some parts of Prospect Park. Summer Stage, if you go to a Summer Stage show, that money's going to parks programming, which is really exciting. This last year, Governor's Ball added a $1 surcharge voluntarily because all this money goes back to the general fund, voluntarily added a $1 surcharge, which went to the Alliance for Flushing Meadows. And most recently, Under the Cave Bridge will have a new model for 2025 where there will be a small fee that goes to the Under the Cave Bridge Fund, which helps fund Under the Cave Bridge, which is a delightful new park. So we see little models of this around, but what we're lacking is this kind of, again, citywide mechanism.
Great. So for both of you, then my last question is just like, so what's next? What's needed to make this happen? And I guess part of that question is when I ask about what's needed, how do we make sure if there is a surcharge that it is really in a lockbox for parks?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to start with that one. So part of the challenge, as John was just alluding to, is that when there is new money generated, it's going back into the city's general fund. The lease agreements that the Yankee Stadium and Citi Field have currently, and all of these agreements that, for instance, Governor's Ball had originally, the money goes back to the city. Obviously, the city needs funds, but the challenge is that none of that money will go to parks unless it's allocated through the budget process. And we've seen, over now decades that parks has been unable to kind of break out of getting about 0.6% of the city's budget. The unmet kind of state of good repair needs in parks have grown to close to $1 billion. That might even be an undercount. We're just struggling to keep up. And so one mechanism that's needed is to ensure that new revenues are reserved for parks maintenance. We're proposing what we're calling a Parks Improvement Fund. And this would be a mechanism, a vehicle created by the state, not dissimilar to how the state created Hudson River Park Trust or even Battery Park originally, but with a very different purpose. The purpose would be to capture these revenues and ensure that they're spent on parks maintenance. We've got a couple of other ideas for how to do that. In particular, we think it would be helpful or even essential that there be legislation as part of the legislation to create the trust and to initiate the surcharge, that it also require the city to fund parks at or above a certain baseline funding level so that it couldn't just kind of raid the Parks Improvement Fund to cover the parks budget. We think that should be city tax levy money and that this could be supplemental and on top of it. And that crucially, we think that then the city council would play a role in actually initiating the surcharge, passing legislation to create the surcharge with the authorization of the state. That's not absolutely required necessarily. It would make it more airtight. It would, eliminate some questions about state jurisdiction. And then finally, we think there's an opportunity for, as part of that legislation, which then the mayor obviously would have to sign, to ensure that there's some transparency in how the money is spent. Requiring the Parks Department, let's say, to publish a report every year on what happens with the Parks Improvement Fund money. So those are some of the key next steps. It would have to be a partnership between the state and the city to get this done.
All right, then. We've got a great panel. Let's get that started. So that's all for the three of us, but Eli's going to stay on and moderate this panel. If our panelists could come up, I'm going to sit down. But thank you both.
Great. Thanks so much.
Also, I was going to say, there are seats. Please sit down.
Hey. Anywhere's good. Yeah, go for it. Mics are all a little low, so you may want to just adjust them up. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. All right. Yeah, feel free to come on in. Folks in the back, take your seats. Thank you all so much for being here today. Such a pleasure to see you and to participate in this conversation with all of you. And I'm just mentioning again to our audience, we'll save time for questions, comments at the end of our session, so stay tuned for that. But I would love to kick things off just by briefly mentioning who's up here with me. Their full bios are in your programs. If you scan that QR code, so I won't give a whole long introduction, but just to mention who we're joined with today. So to my left is Adam Ganser, the Executive Director of New Yorkers for Parks. Great to have you here, Adam. Heather Luboff is the Executive Director of the City Parks Foundation. Morgan Monaco is the Park Administrator and the head of the Prospect Park Alliance. Lynn Kelly, who is the Executive Director of the New York Restoration Project. And last but not least, Senator Brad Hoylman-Siegel, State Senator Brad Hoylman-Siegel. Perfect timing. So great to have you here with us today. So welcome, all of you. Thank you for being part of this conversation. And thanks for sitting through our chat about the idea with a little more detail. We didn't want to put you all on the spot to actually describe the idea in detail. In fact, we want to get your thoughts about why it's so important, what the opportunity is, what the challenge is, how to make this idea the strongest version of itself that it can be. But let me start by asking a little bit, because we barely broached this part of this conversation in our 10 minutes there, about why parks needs more funding. And I think folks might look at the city budget. If they do, they see that there's $615 to $640 million in there for parks, and maybe just wonder, isn't that enough? Aren't we where we need to be? So maybe Adam, I'll start with you. Where are we when it comes to funding parks today? What's the problem, both in terms of dollars and need, but also how it's funded, and help us understand that.
Yeah, we've talked about this many times, but the agency is historically underfunded looking back over the last 40 years. The main issue, I would say, are two things: basic head count, number of people on the ground doing the work, and having reliable jobs that are in positions for more than 1 year. What the agency and the city council and the administration do a lot of the time is they'll fund positions for 1 year. Those positions are then needing to be renewed each year. The people who are in those positions feel insecure and often leave, so we're operating with a depleted staff. This coming into this year, we had a big push on parks advocacy and funding in November, in the November mod, which wasn't successful, but it set us up for a really strong argument now in January. And we've seen some initial good movement by the administration. So the numbers look better, but the challenge there is fully $50 million of the new budget is for increased salary amounts, so collective bargaining. So you're seeing an increase in total dollar amount, at least at this point, but again, a reduction in staff and an inconsistency of how that staff is brought in.
Well, I appreciate that, Adam. And I guess let's bring that home for people just to understand what that looks like in the local level. Maybe Morgan, I'll turn to you because you're in a park every day and seeing it firsthand.
Yes.
A park that benefits from some of these kind of public-private partnerships, but also faces huge maintenance needs. So just help us understand, what is the maintenance challenge for parks? What does it look like in Prospect Park? What does it look like in parks that don't have an alliance to support them?
Yeah, thank you, Eli. So, sometimes there's a misconception out there that just because a park has a conservancy or an alliance or friends of group, that all of the maintenance needs are addressed. And for Prospect Park, that is certainly not the case. So we have a longstanding 40-year public-private partnership, but the alliance is responsible for much of the capital program. We're lucky that we have in-house architects and landscape architects that help to revitalize and restore our historic structures. We are responsible for the 350 acres of natural areas. We manage all the concessions, and we have a robust public programs department offering environmental education programs and a wonderful volunteer program, which we very much rely upon for addressing some of the maintenance needs. But the day-to-day trash pickup, the facilities maintenance, and the keeping things in a state of good repair is still incumbent upon the city, and we very much rely on the Parks Department for those day-to-day maintenance needs. So even though there is a whole cadre, and Lynn and I have the privilege of being the co-chairs of the Parks and Open Spaces Partners Coalition, POSP, it's a mouthful, who was created actually out of the pandemic when all of the kind of friends of groups, conservancies, and partner groups came together to kind of support each other during the crisis, during the pandemic, and compare notes, but also figure out how we were going to do more with less, given that brought upon major cuts to the Parks Department's budget. And so I think it's really important to get the word out there that there is a robust network of over 50 different nonprofit organizations that support some of our major parks and open spaces, but that doesn't mean that the city is free of its obligation to care and fully fund for its park system. So Prospect Park is one of many who rely upon the city for the basic day-to-day maintenance and care.
I appreciate that, Morgan. I guess I'd love to, open it up to other folks to tell us a little bit more about the need out there, and even some of the numbers, making them kind of real for folks. I mean, when I mentioned $725, billion in unmet, $1 million in unmet need, basic state of good repair need. What do New Yorkers see that kind of accounts for that? I mean, what are the day-to-day experiences like? Maybe I'll turn to Heather or Lynn, that New Yorkers might actually recognize and resonate with them to think that really does affect my day-to-day use and existence as a New Yorker.
You want to go? Okay, I'll start. I'll give you one example. We do work in Kaiser Park along the Coney Island Creek, which is a beautiful park. So we have programs for kids. We teach soccer and track, and we have environmental education programs. I went to do a site visit this summer on a Monday morning, and the park is heavily used, and I walked in and there's trash everywhere, all over the park, and that's what the kids were playing in. I mean, that was the environment. It's not the fault of the Parks Department, they just hadn't gotten there to clean up. You can't expect volunteers to come in every Monday morning and clean up after a busy weekend. It's not my responsibility to clean up my park. It's my responsibility to pay my taxes so that the city cleans up the park. But parks all over the city are like that, and it's it is definitely not the fault of the workers because they are working harder than ever, and there are fewer and fewer of them to do that work. But that's what New Yorkers encounter on a daily basis. And that's just maintenance. When you ask about state of good repair, if you think about, sidewalks that are cordoned off, if you think about stairways that are just broken, every time it rains, I remember in Marcus Garvey Park, although this was finally fixed after, 20 years, every time it rained, there would be a pool, and you'd have to walk around it every day. And, it collected mosquitoes, and this is not the environment that people should be working in and that people should experience when you go to a park for recreation, for improving your mental health, which is what parks do, and then that's what you encounter. This is not what New Yorkers deserve, and I have to say, parks improve neighborhoods. They are one of the reasons that people move to certain neighborhoods. They are an attraction. They are a tourist attraction. But they are not any of those things when they are not in good repair.
Heather.
I've been fortunate that I've spent the better part of 20 plus years of my career working with the Parks Department, advocating for green spaces, running a green space organization. And, I can say based on what I've seen is that we really are at a true breaking point. The city has not, in recent years, really acknowledged parks as critical city infrastructure and funded it as such. And that's unfortunate because, as Heather's well mentioned, it's not the fault of the Parks Department. They're not magicians. They are not miracle workers. They can only but do with so much that they have. And not every neighborhood has the availability of a volunteer group, a stewardship group, a conservancy. So when we have these kind of conversations, which I'll agree with you, are provocative. Nobody wants to add more charges, add more money, go out of their pocket. These are provocative conversations. But if we don't have them now, then when? We've been kicking this can down the road for 40 years, and we can't anymore. So if you look at the numbers that are in the Cuff report, and I want to thank Cuff for doing this and the work. This was a conversation long in the making, and it's exciting that we're up here today, even if it makes us all a little nervous, and it should, right? Because this is an important conversation. But even at the lowest levels, if you took $40 million, right? So the stretch was from 30-something to 190, right? Even if you take on the lower end, $40 million, which is by no way even going to make parks whole, right? It still gets PEP officers, parks, patrol officers. It'll get maintenance and operation workers, forestry crews. So what does that mean? It means that the parks that are out in Coney Island, East New York, Queens, other areas, actually get service. It means that bathroom will be open. It means that bathroom will be clean. Many of us take for granted that ever since the conservancy movement that started in, the 70s, thanks to New Yorkers for Parks, right, largely, and continued through the 80s till today, that parks in our day-to-day lives where we may walk around look a hell of a lot better than they did perhaps if you grew up here. However, that is not the case in many neighborhoods, unfortunately, in New York. And so we've been kicking this can down the road for 40 years, and we have a real equity issue here when it comes to our green spaces. So I say we need to have more conversations about this, even if they're provocative and challenging, because we're not getting anywhere where we are today. I will get off my soapbox. I clearly am very passionate about our green spaces, and I want to thank Cuff for raising it.
Thank you, Lynn. Well, Senator, I'd love to bring you into this conversation in a couple ways, but one is, what Lynn is getting at around the feasibility of an idea like this, but also the necessity of an idea like this one. And, you're in the middle of negotiating $250 billion budget, and, the city has a modest, 120 by comparison. These are big budgets. But as we've seen in the past couple of weeks, with some big out-year gaps, some big challenges, fiscal challenges. And that's even before we get to the potential for billions of dollars in fewer dollars from the federal government. I mean, right now, New York City alone is facing out-year budget gaps of $9 or maybe $10 billion almost. When you combine what we're actually paying every year, the actual expenses, with the revenues, and you look at the difference. So in that context, understanding that that's kind of where we are as a city, as a state, I'd love to get your thoughts about the practicality of new revenues in this moment. As Jonathan mentioned earlier, there's maybe not a lot of appetite in this very second to kind of put more dollars, more costs on New Yorkers, but we also face some very troubling fiscal realities and the desperate need to fund this vital infrastructure. So I want to ask you in general about your thoughts about how we get there, if you agree that new revenues are part of the equation, and what it would look like to kind of get behind new revenues in a political but also fiscal moment like this one.
No, well, thank you, and thank you for organizing this, and thank you to Cuff for this really important report. I represent the west side of Manhattan, from Christopher Street up to West 103rd, or as I like to say, from the gay bars to Zay bars. And we have some amazing parks adjacent: Washington Square Park, Central Park, Riverside Park. And we are a park-starved neighborhood, including the Hudson River Park. And every year, just to take the Hudson River Park an example, which, by the way, is going to benefit from a tremendous, I think it's 70 million that the governor has proposed in her executive budget for Riverside Park, and particularly Pier 76. It's a 10-cup mentality. We have to keep going back to the trough every year. And in lean budget times, as we are in the midst of, there's a sense, and it's totally mistaken, that parks are the first thing on the cutting block. And we know from experience, personal experience from my constituents, that parks are a great attraction, an important part of the city's infrastructure, an important part of attracting businesses and young people and a thriving economy. I'd put it up there with affordable housing and good public schools. Great public parks and arts and culture are essential to the future of our city. So it is crucial that we look at this issue very closely. I support a dedicated revenue stream because it's the only way that I see that parks are not going to be continually on the chopping block. Is there an appetite in Albany? Well, there's an appetite in Albany for a lot of things. But it'll be a matter of our city elected officials in Albany working in conjunction, recognizing the need. And I think there's some synergy to a surcharge on entertainment venues as a way to give back to open spaces. I mean, I think there's some rationale that we could perhaps sell successfully to my colleagues. As you know, New York City needs authorization from the state government to impose such a tax or surcharge. And, I'd be willing to help lead that in Albany. And I'd be working closely with Senator Kruger, also a Manhattan colleague who's chair of the Finance Committee, as well as our colleagues in the Assembly. So, yes, I think there's an appetite. Let me put that coda on it.
That is great to hear, Senator.
Yeah.
Thank you for your leadership on the issue, on parks in general, on the vitality of our neighborhoods. It's so important. And I'd love to talk with all of you a little bit more about how we do what you're suggesting, how we get there, and what we would need to do to make this idea this strongest version of itself. I mean, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, we proposed an idea. We didn't say this is it, in stone, signed, sealed, and delivered. We want to have a robust conversation about it. We think the idea will get stronger and more feasible the more we air it out and test it, road test it, and get feedback on it. So I'd like to ask that question of all of you in terms of, when we look at the range, as Lynn was saying, from a relatively very modest, 1%, which I think most consumers wouldn't notice, to something significantly higher, like $190 million a year, but that might be then comparable to New York City sales tax. When we look at which venues should be part of this or which ones maybe don't make as much sense, other exemptions or exclusions that should be considered, I'd love to get your input on all of this. What would you say would make this idea the strongest version of itself?
I have a couple of thoughts more on the back end of it that you start to address in the report. But the idea of creating a trust or a fund into which these revenues would go, that is dedicated to parks. That's a unique thing for New York City. You talked about individual parks that are getting direct revenues. We talked about Brooklyn Bridge Park, which has a very unique and unusual model that is tremendously successful because the revenue from the real estate comes into that park. Similarly, the High Line had been able to negotiate through zoning revenues that were coming directly to the High Line through zoning bonuses that happened at the Hudson Yards. Those are one or two examples. When you start to talk about creating a fund, that's great that it's fully dedicated to the Parks Department, but there has to be something on the other side of that that requires the city a minimum amount of commitment to funding the rest of the parks. Otherwise, you'll see what has happened with the Conservancy model, which was intended to take some of the lift off of the city and has done that and created some really great parks in the process, but the city's part of the bargain has been they've just abdicated that. So instead of increasing funding for the rest of the parks that don't have that private funding, they've been able to ignore it. So there'd have to be some way to ensure that the city is holding up its end of the bargain, and this just doesn't pull away from city funding. I also want to talk a little bit about one of the parks in the city that generates probably the most revenue, which is Flushing Meadows. You mentioned Citi Field and the USTA, and the agreements with those two entities that are in that park can range from $40 to $70 million a year. $40 to $7 million a year, that's more than what we're talking about through this surcharge. Again, that goes to the city fund. It does not go back to that park. That park has roughly 18 city employees. It's one of the largest parks in the city. That's ridiculous. A little bit of a sidetrack, the proposal out there for a casino near Citi Field, which includes a brand new city park completely paid for by and maintained by the entity proposing that development. Thinking creatively, we are not going to be against that proposal or the alienation in that proposal, but that is also a way to start clawing back numbers for Flushing Meadows. There's revenues that would be generated there that could support the existing park that is in tough shape. So I wouldn't want to take away the idea of these one-off agreements that have been successful. So I think we need to be working in two lanes on this, a citywide model and then these individual opportunities that come up.
That's great, Adam. And I would just add, the idea of that Parks Improvement Fund, potentially that could be funded with multiple revenue streams.
Absolutely.
And, those lease agreements come up for renewal, there's definitely an opportunity there.
Yeah, the only point I'm making is, say you're able through multiple strings to raise $300 million a year there, what prevents the city from reducing its commitments by that same dollar amount?
Yeah. Heather, go ahead. Yeah.
I am not a policymaker, but I have a couple of thoughts. First is I worked at the New York Public Library at the time when the E-rate legislation was passed. And the E-rate was a program that collected fees through telephone bills and then re-granted that money out to schools and libraries across the country to upgrade their internet access. It was when people were still installing broadband and many schools did not have any internet access. And there was a huge uproar. Oh my God, no one's going to pay this. There are going to be protests. The telecoms are going to add millions of dollars to their bills and people are going to be furious. And nothing happened. They did it, and there were literally billions of dollars distributed to schools and libraries. And New York Public, that first year, got I'm trying to remember, something like $6 million, no, it was like $60 million, some crazy number, just to install broadband and buy computers and routers. And it was life-changing for the library to do that. And nobody said a word, nobody complained at all. And that was just one experience. I think if my friends at Live Nation and Bowery are listening to me, I'm sorry, I apologize. But, I think the concert business is up by a huge amount. And if people understand and there's transparency about what those fees are going for, I do not believe that ticket buyers will object. It's $1. If you're buying a ticket for $100, it's not going to have an impact on your wallet. I believe that strongly. And I believe that studies show that as long as there is transparency, people will not object.
Thanks, Heather. Senator, I'd like to bring in a little bit on that point as well, and I certainly want to hear from everybody about their thoughts about making this idea the strongest version of itself. But Senator, I also want to ask you a little bit about, this very two points there. I think one is the very specific idea of a parks improvement fund, which, as in your role as a member of the committee on corporations, I think would play a role there. In terms of feasibility, there's also this point about ensuring that the dollars actually are used for this intended purpose. One idea that we floated in our proposal is legislation that would require the city to maintain funding for the Parks Department at or above a certain baseline in order to tap the fund. I'd love to get your thoughts as we go about the feasibility of both of those elements, or really it's a combined aspect of this, separate from just the authorization for the city to pass this legislation. I'd love your thoughts about, is that doable? Does it make sense? Are there any ways in which you would advise kind of proceeding with that part of the idea?
Well, I was just thinking, recalling Madison Square Garden hasn't paid property taxes in over 40 years. So let's make that, part of our campaign, that, and we've subsidized entertainment and sports venues across the state. We put over $1 billion into the Buffalo Bills stadium. I voted against it, for the record, but there is this, we all want to jump at funding entertainment and sports venues. I think we need to also be mindful of funding open space and public assets like parks. I think the issue of control and oversight is important. We just have to look at congestion pricing and the suspicions by some of my colleagues, and some of them sound, frankly, to ensure that that money is used in the way it is intended, is very important. We wouldn't want, to create a slush fund or something that would be called a slush fund that doesn't have oversight and there is no accountability for how the funds are used. I do think the idea of, hitting requiring a threshold investment by the city in order to tap such a fund is a really sound idea. I think that would give some of my colleagues confidence that the city, wouldn't abdicate its responsibilities to fund parks because there's this new, separate account. But let's make it a requirement for them to tap into it. But at the end of the day, again, I think it's going to be very important that however this is structured, that colleagues at both the local and state level have some ability to understand how those funds are used and they are used properly.
Thank you, Senator. Just really quick point before we proceed, hearing from our friends that are tuned into the live stream, they've all asked if folks could just make sure their microphones are a little closer to them. That's how they're getting the sound. I think hopefully people in the room are hearing us okay. And people are leaning into their computer speakers right now, waiting on every word. So I want to make sure they can hear us okay. But thank you, Senator. So yeah, I want to actually, Morgan and Lynn, bring you in on this point as well, in terms of shaping, refining the idea, in terms of the advocacy strategy, and how do we move something like this forward, and would love your thoughts.
There's lots of ways to move this forward. I think that the good news is that we're not starting from scratch, right? There's now the Playfair Coalition. There's New Yorkers for Parks. There's Parks and Open Space Partners. There's already a network of community-based organizations, parks professionals, people in the field that have started some of the grassroots work on advocacy. But we can't do this alone, right? This is going to take all of you and your neighbors and friends and your friends of friends' neighbors to really work with us collectively to have some of these difficult conversations. And they're going to be challenging, right? With the administration, with the powers that be in the state to affect legislation. It's going to take a marketing campaign. It's going to take, all the things you would expect with grassroots advocacy. But I think it's also going to take a willingness on all of our parts to acknowledge that if everybody in the end is a little bit happy, we've succeeded, right? So that means also the city keeping open and a willingness to engage in these conversations. Related to that, and related to some of the points about how we get this done, one thing that's always struck me, and this is the real policy wonk in me, is that I never quite understood, like, what happens with the general fund, right? So once the money is kind of collected from agencies, and I understand why it was established, this was established back in the 70s as a result of just making sure that, you know, there was no corruption amongst agencies and agencies. This is coming out of the fiscal crisis, right? We're a long way since that, and there's lots of measures in place. But it strikes me that agencies, and there's always going to be agencies that are unable to generate revenue. Perhaps it's not their focus or their core, you know, charter. But amongst the ones that do, if you don't actually have transparency about how then the money is allocated afterward, or what are the criteria by which money is then allocated, it creates, at least for me, what I'm glib in saying this, but like this Wizard of Oz scenario, like what happens? And I do think that related to both advocacy, which we need to do, understanding how we work with legislature and the technical aspect, home rule, city council rule, et cetera. We also could be having conversations now about looking at, does a system that was established arguably almost 50 years ago working now, or could there be some improvements?
Well said, Lynn. I'll just add again, you know, conversations like the one we're having this morning are very much part of how we move this forward. There's a lot of ideas on the table, and it's going to take several, you know, further conversations and reactions from everyone across the sector and beyond to give their feedback. And I think it's important to, again, look at precedent, right? So many different examples were shared at the beginning of the conversation. And then, you know, from Prospect Park's perspective, you know, we have a wonderful relationship with BRIC and Celebrate Brooklyn, and they voluntarily offer a $2 donation for every paid ticket sold. So 60% of all Celebrate Brooklyn shows have to be free to the public, but 40% can be charged, and in that 40%, $2 of every ticket sold goes directly back into Prospect Park. And as I said, kind of the four pillars of our work, one of those pillars is our, you know, managing all of our concessions. We have an arrangement such that the revenue from all of those concessions goes directly back into the park. That is not the case for many other organizations and many parks across the city. But again, we're not talking about something that's totally revolutionary. This is happening across the city in many different forms and variations across the 40-year history of these organizations existing. So I think it's important. The road ahead is really kind of parsing out all of the different policy ideas and recommendations, the precedents that have already been set, and as Lynn said, coming up with some compromise where there is a shift. And the last thing I'll say is that it's really important to us as kind of representatives of this coalition to recognize that, you know, as advocates, yes, we have a point of view, and yes, we're kind of stomping our foot or tapping our foot saying the city needs to do more, but we're not immune to the fact that the city has to make difficult choices and that there needs to be a growing of revenue in order to accommodate this deficit. So I think it's as Lynn said, just echoing what she said, having a number of different difficult conversations, but coming at a place where we can move the needle forward with, you know, addressing decades of disinvestment.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. There is certainly, there are budget considerations every year for the city, and the last few years have been really, really difficult. But just again, to put it in perspective, we're spending $900 million on police overtime this year, which is 50% more than we're spending on our city's parks. A lot of these are bullshit policy decisions that the administration is making. There is money to fund parks. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be absolutely attacking alternative revenue streams and building the capacity to create more funding. But I would really like to emphasize that the city has the money to fund parks. A lot of the reasons we're doing this is because they're deciding to not use the money for parks. So it's putting the sector in a position to say, we're tired of being victims of your budget process. We need to start taking control of these spaces and making them better for New Yorkers. As far as the marketing side of this, I think one of the things that we've seen in advocacy is when everything sucks, you can't get anybody focused on a single issue. So one of the ways that I think that this could be successful is if it's initially, I'm not saying long term, targeted on one or two key aspects that are really, really failing in the Parks Department. could this money go to building the most robust swim program in the country for New York City, as an example? Could it be used to build out a fleet and team of rangers, which has been funded at 50 rangers for the entire park system? And what are the impacts to New Yorkers for that one change? And we're seeing it now. Our advocacy is really pointing on public safety. We're focusing on the urban forests and trees. We're focusing on those things because public safety is top of mind for every single New Yorker, quality of life. And we've just seen our parks on fire and things are happening in LA. These are resonant. And if you can narrow the focus of it and get the population dialed into the impact and the results, that might be a way a public campaign could be more.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that we've been, asking our parks officials and our conservancies to take on roles, particularly as it pertains to public safety, mental health, and addiction, that they are not qualified to do, nor should they be, providing that support. Washington Square Park's a good example of an issue that I hear about continually from my constituents. It's unsafe for many, in the minds of many New Yorkers. The northwest corner is like a zone that, people are afraid to walk into. And we need to change that. And I think part of that could be an effort like this. The other thing, the backdrop for this, though, which is, the backdrop of Albany at the moment, is the affordability crisis. And so, we have to understand that the governor just announced a rebate check for middle-class New Yorkers. There's an effort, to push back on issues like congestion pricing because of the affordability crisis that exists, that it's very expensive to live in this city, and we have to confront that issue head on in such a public relations effort.
Add to that. So sometimes it bothers me that there's this kind of binary way that we look at affordability, right? And there's no question, I'm not arguing that we have an affordability crisis, we do, but I would also say, but aren't parks so much part of the core of affordability in New York City? It's like the most democratic spaces in our 5 boroughs, where you can have the most affordable experience of your day, whether it's a walk, a picnic, a working out on gym equipment. They function as, in my mind, some of the most affordable gathering spaces in New York. Different than housing, I understand. But I want us to really they're not mutually exclusive. And it bothers me that the dialogue has become a very binary, one or the other. And while, yes, affordable housing, very, very important, I'm not arguing that, but can we please look at our parks and infrastructure as a key part of keeping New York City affordable? Full stop.
Yep. No,
I wish I would have had that applause line.
To that point,
no, I completely agree. And I think part of it is that New Yorkers, public officials, and others take parks for granted. And we can't do that, and we have to shake ourselves out of that mindset.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, Len. We've had this administration, and Dana Garodnick has had a huge success with City of Yes, which has been an incredibly creative new angle on developing affordable housing and making affordable housing happen in New York. And as that has crossed the finish line, it is time for City of Parks. It's a time for an integrated approach to affordable design and affordable development and building of open space and maintaining of open space. And I think that's what New Yorkers are craving.
So I really appreciate these thoughts, everyone. And I think it's helpful to start to reframe or frame how this would actually move forward as an advocacy campaign. We're not the advocates, we're not lobbyists, we're researchers, we're policy wonks. We care deeply about supporting a public park system that is healthy, inclusive, equitable, robust, vibrant, because we believe, Lynn, as you said, and Senator, as you said, this is absolutely essential infrastructure for a thriving city into the future. And that as a parent with 2 young kids, it is one of the only affordable places I can go every single day, it's keeping me here as a parent of young kids, our parks. But we experience those challenges, those maintenance issues every day. I can't push a stroller if the park's flooded.
Yeah.
Forest Park is full of, human waste, and it's difficult to navigate.
I was at the gym the other day, and I was on the treadmill, and there was this young man running next to me. He was talking on his headset, which was annoying at first, until I started listening to his conversation. And he was saying, he was in his, he's clearly like in his mid-20s. He has a significant other. He wants to stay in New York, but it's too stressful, too expensive. His fiance doesn't want to raise her kids here. That's the challenge that I think parks can address, just as you point out, that young families need parks. New York needs young families. So let's marry all of these desires together.
You got that applause line you're looking for, Senator. Very nicely done.
Thank you. I got it.
So I just want to ask a couple more questions about next steps, and we'll open it up to our amazing audience as well. But one of those, actually, Senator, I'll come back to you just to begin. As we researched this idea and road tested it, we also came against the challenges around the city enacting legislation on its own to generate new revenue. So I just would love it if you could help, especially I think folks have a lot of questions about how that would work and why the state, frankly, would need to be involved. So if you could just sort of maybe help us understand a little bit more about your thoughts on why and how the state would have to authorize the city to do this. And then what the mechanisms might look like. Is that something that you think should happen in the budget process? Is it more helpful if it happens outside of the budget process? I'd love to get your input there.
Well, to take your last question first, it could happen within the budget process or outside of it. Generally speaking, revenue items happen within the budget process. Our budget process has begun in earnest and will last officially until the 1st of April, probably a little later than that. So it could happen then, but we'd have to get, our act together pretty quickly. The Senate and the Assembly each propose one House bills. We could introduce a bill authorizing New York City to establish such a fund and a tax, a surcharge on ticket sales. That could be a standalone bill that then the Assembly and the Senate could offer in their one houses. Since it's not in the governor's executive budget, we in each respective house propose our own budgets, if you will, and then the governor, through negotiation, will pick and choose those items to add to the final enacted budget. Yes, would be required that the state provide the authorization to New York City. The cities, all municipalities, are a creature of the state, so that is a requirement. And it's possible that a home rule message would be required.
Mm-hmm.
Home rule messages are required by statute when the state enacts certain provisions specifically directed at a local municipality. And there are ways to get around that. You could potentially authorize such a surcharge for cities of 1 million residents or more, which technically is not directed at one municipality, but of course we all know it would only apply to New York City. And so there are a number of different approaches that could be taken to get this through the legislative sausage making.
And I'll add, we're in an important mayoral election moment, right? We have the June primary upon us. It'll be here before we know it. And we appreciate, the audience here helping join our advocacy efforts and making your opinions known about the value and importance of our park system. Literally, just after this, many of us are going down to City Hall for a rally in the, 16-degree weather. We're park people, so I guess we're used to that.
Heavy sweater.
Yes, there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad gear. But I think that's what it's going to take is, the ingredients that make up a successful campaign is, getting the message out broadly, making sure that there's opportune moments, speaking with candidates, making sure that this issue is top of mind. Letter writing campaigns, all of the, strategies that our brothers and sisters in the culturals and libraries have deployed successfully with last year's budget are the things that we're thinking about for our cause right now.
But I also think, speaking on behalf of the culturals, because we do produce Summer Stage, so we are also a cultural organization, being mindful of the sensitivities around particularly nonprofit cultural organizations and the fact that they are still having difficulty after COVID with ticket sales and fundraising. So I just want to make sure that as we put this together, the entities that we're charging are not the entities that are suffering.
The last thing I'd say on this, and thank you, Morgan, for bringing up the rally. If you have a spare 45 minutes in a big jacket, showing us at City Hall. But conversations like this that get outside of the kind of small park sector that is all talking about these issues. What we need is people who are in culturals, families, faith-based organization. We need a much broader group of New Yorkers talking about the problem and bringing up the issues. And then, again, going back to what Lynn said, these types of conversations make a lot of people uncomfortable. After this was announced, I told Eli I got 10 to 15 phone calls and emails from people on my board, from people who own sports teams saying this is bullshit. This is never going to happen. Our lobbyists are going to go after it. Well, at least you're talking about parks, at least you're hearing what the problem is. And the more we can do that, the more it's going to be in the ether, and that's really one of the main goals.
Really helpful.
And the idea of this being part of campaigns across the city is a really good one. I think New Yorkers for Parks did that back in 2001, was it? Percent for parks?
1% for parks.
Was a whole campaign effort. You had candidates sign on to whether they were for or against it. And, I think it's a really good headline for candidates, to try to aspire to and discuss at, venues as these campaigns kick off.
That's helpful. One last quick question about kind of the mechanism of doing this, something that's come up in a couple of the conversations since we published the report even. We in the report mentioned the resale market. That alone is, $600 or so million a year, maybe more. A significant portion and some of the highest dollar sales in the whole city happen in that market, and we think that's a potential opportunity there. But one other area that's come up certainly are the ticketing platforms themselves, and as we proposed, this is not a surcharge on venues. Venues wouldn't pay it, consumers would pay it as we initially proposed it. But certainly another option that could be on the table is finding a way for the platforms to pay for this. They charge in New York City market, upwards of a third of the cost of a ticket, right, goes to those platforms and their own fees. There's certainly been some energy even at the national level to address those hidden fees. And I'm curious if you all have any thoughts about the potential for some of the revenue, or maybe all of it, to actually come from, rather than the ticket buying public and certainly not the venues themselves, but from the payment platform, the ticketing platforms.
Well, they have extremely powerful lobbyists in Albany, and I imagine at City Hall too, particularly the ticket resellers, StubHub and the like. That said, they'll say that they'll pass this on to consumers. Yeah. But, we got to take them on. This is, I think the public good is at stake, and perhaps there's a way to bring them along. There's a lot of discussion, there has been over the last several sessions around transparency, particularly in the ticket resale market, and we've taken a number of steps toward that, but perhaps this can be folded into that effort.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the transparency piece in this case, I think, actually benefits the effort. Because if you're in New York, you know the situation with our city's parks, and if you're seeing that this is going towards something that you believe in, maybe you are less inclined to complain about it. If it's a hidden charge, you're just seeing your ticket price goes up. There's another example of this, which is not exactly the same. When I was at the High Line, we had relationships with hotels near the High Line, and there were quite a few that were popping up back in the early 2010s and 15s. And we had an agreement with those hotels that they would create a little checkbox on their bill, would you like to give $1 to the High Line? Totally transparent, and it actually generated a fair amount of revenue because a lot of the people who were going to those hotels were going to be going to the Highline and didn't fully understand how that park was paid for. So I think that there's a benefit to the transparency when it's for a public good.
That's really helpful, Adam. Well, on that note, I'd like to have a little more transparency by turning it over to our amazing audience in this conversation. And I will say, for all of you tuned in online, you can also ask your questions, your comments there. We welcome your ideas and suggestions. You can tweet at us. I think our handles are there as well on Blue Sky. Some of my colleagues will be collecting your input online as well. For folks in the room, I would just say a couple things. One, we'll be coming around with microphones, so I appreciate your hands are up. I'll call on you. Please keep your question or your remark to just 1 minute so we can get to as many people as possible. And if you let us know who you are, if you're here with an organization, that would be great as well. So we'll start with David there in the middle row. Keep your hand up for a second. The microphone's coming to you, and I promise we'll get to as many folks as possible. Great, thank you.
Hi, Dave Saltonstall from the Central Park Conservancy, and I don't know if this is mostly a question for Brad, but in terms of getting this done and over the line, you know, Albany so often breaks down between like upstate versus downstate stuff, and, you know, Buffalo has a huge new stadium. They also have a park system. Like, could this idea also be applicable and interesting to Buffalo or to many of the communities in Long Island that have venues, you know, and park systems? And why not broaden the coalition a little bit? So it's not just about New York City, but it is of benefit to many cities in the state that, you know, have both venues and park systems that are probably hurting.
You know, I think that's a great point, David, that this could help other localities that, you know, frankly might be struggling with their own tax system. There's a feeling on Long Island and the Hudson Valley that, you know, property taxes are too high. Perhaps this could siphon off some of that pressure in those parts of the state. I'll say something else that this how this proposal benefits. There was one of my colleagues, I think about a decade ago, proposed what he called a 20% solution, where he wanted to siphon off funding from conservancies, from private conservancies, to more needy parks, which was really well received, I have to say, in Albany at the time. We didn't get it across the finish line because mainly the Senate was controlled by Republicans. But to me, it points, the fact that it generated as much interest as it did at the time when there was a Republican controlled Senate suggests that this idea could really have legs, because I think it's more fair. I think it doesn't, you know, it's not a Robin Hood model that would have a lot of unintended consequences, I think many of us thought, and that there's a need, as you say, across the state. So I think we should look at that.
Thank you, Senator. And we'll go to Lucy there in the fourth row.
Thanks so much to all of you. I'm Lucy Sexton, New Yorkers for Culture and Arts. The elephant in the room is, of course, why are you taxing culture to pay for parks? But I really would say that like, I am a parks person, right? I grew up in Brooklyn in the 1960s and 70s. We have 6 siblings. We went to the Prospect Park every day. My mother always said that's why she could raise us there, right? She also sent me to dance class in downtown Brooklyn, and I became a lifelong performing artist. Culture is struggling. Many of the things you guys talked about in your advocacy, we are at a breaking point, right? So why I totally get, you know, the stadiums that are on parkland should tithe to the parks, 100%. But even in the big venues, you know, we have theaters closing every single week. Look at the papers. Like, we are in a bad shape. We have individual artists that are living below the poverty level, majority of which. So, you know, when you say, yes, we're going to, you know, there'll be a surcharge on Broadway, which has these big tickets. Broadway is struggling to figure out how to make their financial model work because it's not working. But if they do have a surcharge, why wouldn't it go to fund those nonprofit theaters? If they do have a surcharge on the Rihanna show at Barclays Center, why wouldn't it go to support those many, many musicians, thousands of musicians that are working below the poverty line? You talk about advocacy, I'm all in. We are also looking for a dedicated funding stream. I think this is a brilliant idea. I just think we should work together because you have 3 stools that make a great city, right? Culture, parks, libraries. We shouldn't be destroying each other and eating each other to make something good. So let's join forces. Let's think of new ways that we can work together to have dedicated funding streams, taxes, surcharges, whatever, to fund all of our critical quality of life infrastructure. So thank you very much for listening. Sorry.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Adam, if you want to jump in,
Yeah, can I, is this thing on? Can you hear me? Yeah, first of all, having worked in this sector for as long as many of us have, what we've seen over the course of the years is that those three stools are treated the same. Every single year, we're all making the same point, we're all getting the same impact, until this year, when Parks was pulled away from the pack and disproportionately cut last year and didn't get restored this year. We've reached out to the libraries to try to join forces, and I think that there is a strong, stronger together mentality there. What we see ultimately is that when rubber hits the road, everybody wants to make their own arguments. The culturals want to make their own arguments, the libraries want to make their own arguments, and the parks ends up in that situation. If we can iron that out and come together with a unified approach towards this, among the three of us, the percentage of the budget is so small, but we represent literally every New Yorker. So there's a way for us to come together and move this forward together.
Really helpful. Thank you. We'll go to the back row there, Rock. Rachel, if you can bring the microphone back. Thank you. We can try one more time if we can hear it in the mic. Rachel, you want to just speak into it one more time? No? Okay. We'll bring the other one around. Thank you so much. Yep.
No? Yep.
There we go. We got
Hello.
you. Yep.
My name is Irak Shahansky. I'm the Queensboro President, Donovan Richards Jr. Budget Director. We have invested over $40 million in the last 3 fiscal years for, and also the problem we have encountered is the procurement process itself. We have tried that in like 5-6 years now. Having conversations with legislators in Albany, I see that there's not enough focus on the proposal that DDC made in 2024 of creating an authority for the Department of Design and Construction. That will help the city advance a lot of capital dollars that have been staying just there for years. Why is this a Senator and also all the advocates? Have you heard any about this? Thinking on pushing this agenda this legislative year. I think that's a critical part of all these formula in order to maintain parks and keep creating new parks that all New Yorkers deserve.
If you want to jump in, and welcome to Senator.
Yeah, can you repeat where you're from? I didn't hear the.
From the Queensboro President's office.
Oh, great. Yeah. So as part of our work coming into this administration, there was a really big push to reform the capital process, and creating an authority for DDC was one of those major points. There was a big push last year, and it didn't get through the state process. I have no idea where it is. Doing that is a massive lift, and I don't disagree with you that it would have an impact on procurement and the speed of capital projects. I just don't know that that's a realistic thing to happen. We're hoping that it's going to happen, but I think the reforms that the city is making internally is probably the best place to focus our energy and be pushing through electeds as well. And that's an unfortunate answer, but to see an agency get that status of authority is just a colossal lift.
All right, I'll go to Katie here and then come back to the other side of the room and just wait for microphones coming around. I think maybe the overhang was blocking the signal, but for folks in the front should be okay. Great.
Hi, good morning. Katie Denny Horowitz, North Brooklyn Parks Alliance. My organization also runs under the Cambridge Park, which John had mentioned earlier. And John, this might be actually a question for you or maybe Eli. I'm curious in your research, because we talk about how taxpayer dollars goes to fund the agencies and the maintenance that we do have. But the folks who would actually be, the consumers who would be paying this surcharge? In your research, is it mostly New Yorkers, or is it the breakdown of folks coming from outside the city who are benefiting from or demanding these cultural experiences or recreational sports experiences? So that's kind of my first question: is who's actually paying this surcharge? And my next question, or actually it's more of a comment. Y'all are calling it the New York Parks Improvement Fund, right? We had enacted a surcharge. Tickets actually went on sale last week, which was a $2 ticket charge, so not a percentage, but rather a dollar amount. And following kind of like the comments on social media and stuff, the complaints aren't about the Park Restoration Fund. The complaints are about the $25 or more service fee charged by the ticket platform. So, I think in addition to looking at, the fee structure of something like a single ticket price, is this where our focus should be, or should it also be on extraordinary service fees, which are, in this case, $2 versus $26, and where that's coming out of the person's pocket?
Yeah, thanks so much for the comment, Katie. I mean, just to briefly address the first part, it's a mix. Certainly the highest dollar value tickets, generally speaking, a disproportionate share of those buyers are from outside of New York City. New Yorkers definitely would pay, and I don't want to minimize that. Even a $100, $120 ticket, it's not just the folks who live on Park Avenue that are buying those tickets. New Yorkers save up and really kind of care about having those experiences for themselves and their families, and it's tough. We totally get that. I would say certainly as a matter of policy design, we would want to see a surcharge enacted that would have as little an impact on the consumer behavior as possible. And I think it would be hard for me I'm not talking about decades and decades of research on this topic. There's very little. It's pretty thin. But what is out there, as Heather was alluding to, says that people really don't like fees that they don't know what they're for. So what you're seeing anecdotally on Reddit, it does track with the relatively limited research that's been done on this very kind of niche topic. But it also, I think, tracks with common sense. People want to know what the fee's for. If it's for something that they believe in, I don't think generally folks see that they have a big problem with it. As Adam said, people have actually opted into paying fees like that in areas like that, the hotels around the High Line. So, but at the same time, we absolutely would want to dial in a fee, a surcharge, that would have as little an impact on consumer behavior as possible. And we'll see what happens, in your own experiment. But I would imagine that, $2 is not going to make or break anybody's decision to have that amazing experience, at Under the K. And we would want a surcharge that similarly wouldn't do that. And we, to Lucy's other, question, very good points, to make sure that there are some exemptions where we think that there's any risk of having a negative impact on arts and culture itself. Now, as the dollar amount gets lower with a percentage rather than a flat fee, obviously the share goes down. So that would be 40 cents on a $40 ticket or 80 cents on an $80 ticket. Again, I don't know that I could see consumer behavior changing because of that, but we want to be very careful about the impact. And then I just totally agree with your second point there, Katie, and to me that feels like a kind of key part of what we think would be useful about all of this. And I just appreciate the comment. I don't know if other folks want to jump in on those points. We could also go to more folks in the room. Well, let's do it. So all the way on the end there, we can get a microphone down to the end. Thank you.
For reasons, I'm with the New York Independent Venue Association. I did have a statement to read, but it's kind of long, so I'm going to move up because there we go. I just kind of want to double down on what Lucy said. We represent independently owned small venues, nonprofits, small budgets that would be greatly impacted by the cultural implications that come with these additional ticket fees. I mean, transparency is very important. All the points that we've been making about, the additional surcharges and everything, it's affecting how people perceive what the costs are to their ticket. So regardless of what the surcharge is going to be, adding any sort of additional charge to tickets right now, we're not doing well. Concerts are not up, especially for the smaller independently owned businesses. And I wanted to make one point just based off of the examples that you cited. The case making that Cuff uses in the position paper to justify enacting a ticket surcharge to strengthen New York City parks relies solely on the pre-pandemic examples. That's the most important point. The examples that you cited were pre-pandemic. So everything has changed for our industry post-pandemic. The Ohio example was enacted in 2018, and it has a venue capacity exemption, and that is specifically for the arts, that offset. And the Atlanta policy you referenced was enacted in the 1970s. And the ticket surcharges are not levied against all concert and venue tickets throughout Atlanta, as Cuff proposes in New York City, but rather solely on the ticketed events that take place on Parks property. Further, ticket charges are a very small piece of the revenue collected by Atlanta's Park Improvement Fund. So I think there's a lot more research that needs to be had, and just to, part with what Lucy was saying, I think we need to work on this together, and I think you need to consider arts and culture stakeholders when you're making these policy decisions.
Great. Thank you. All right, other questions, comments? We'll go to the back row there. Second from the back, wearing a hat there. And maybe we have time for one or two more.
Yes, hi. So I'm speaking, I do run a parks conservancy, and I'm an enormous advocate for parks and have, donated tens of thousands of volunteer hours to a local park, but I'm not speaking on behalf of my conservancy. So I do think more money should go to parks, but I don't understand why, as a cultural consumer, to echo what the last couple of people have said, that a ticket surcharge, another kind of like regressive tax, should go to the consumer in that way. Why not make, MSG, who hasn't paid taxes on MSG in 40 years? I just went to a hockey game just 2 days ago at MSG, or 3 days ago, and, for me, I can afford it, but the tickets were a fortune, and people, it's not just $1 on one game. People save up and want to go to more than one game. So, I just think there's going to be a lot of backlash on this. And just to piggyback on the procurement issue, because now I will speak as Friends of the East River Esplanade. It is an enormous problem, the way not just procurement, but just actually giving money to the Parks Department, which for those of us that love our colleagues in the Parks Department, it is an extremely dysfunctional agency. So I think internally, a lot of changes have to be made internally before we just throw more money at an agency that needs to be organized from the top down, more like a business. And, they could do a lot more with the money that they have, and a lot more in the procurement process, where money, in the case of our waterfront, hundreds of millions of dollars, have been sent to the agency, and they just can't get ahead of the capital improvements, whether they're capital improvements that are building from scratch or, repairs that have to be done. So I think there's sort of two things, but I really echo what the gentleman over here said. And I also want to speak as a consumer that I think you have to rethink it, like who should really be paying, whether it's the ticket companies or the real estate companies themselves. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I don't know if any of the recent comments spark any responses from folks. We can also keep going with our audience.
I want to say one thing. Whether or not any of us agree with how this is being proposed, what's really important about why this matters is the New York City Green Fund was created during COVID as a way to support parks that were suffering. And the funders said to us, okay, we'll do this now, but you really have to figure out how to do something about funding for parks. So no matter what comes out of this particular discussion, what's really important is that we're having this discussion. Because we cannot rely on the private sector and philanthropy to continue to support what should be a city responsibility. Whether or not a surcharge is the right way to go, that's up for debate. But I'm really, really happy that we were able to use a grant here to generate this discussion, perhaps create a partnership together. I've only worked in libraries, culture, and parks my entire career, so I am thrilled, and I'm just happy that we're having the discussion.
Thanks, Heather.
Can I quickly add, I want to clarify the conversation on capital versus expense, right? So what we're talking about here is exclusively contributing to expense, right? The city has two different revenue streams. Capital comes from bonds, expense comes from city tax levy. So I just want to be very clear so that there's not misinformation. I think the point that was made earlier was about the fact that the capital process is lengthy. That is an important issue to address. The city and state, need to reform the PPB rules that govern the procurement process. And certainly there can be more efficiencies made internally within the Parks Department to manage those projects. But what we're talking about is trying to address this structural deficit between the grave imbalance of capital budget being, leaps and bounds above the expense budget, and the agency can never catch up to keep things in a state of good repair. So if there was adequate expense funding and there were enough city park workers and trades people who could actually maintain the assets through their useful life, they wouldn't need to just rebuild a playground. It could be maintained at a steady clip and last longer. So that's a historic disparity that exists, not just for parks, but the city as a whole. That is an important issue to address. But we're trying to improve the useful life of assets by making sure there's enough park workers to both pick up the trash and maintain facilities.
Deterred maintenance becomes a capital problem.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you. And just quickly add that point, there's something to be said for the need for that staffing, that head count, to actually prevent those small problems from becoming much bigger problems. Part of the challenge that Parks faces is the unpredictability in the budget. We haven't really talked about that yet, but knowing that there's positions that are not baselined in the city budget that are up for renewal every single year. Folks don't want jobs where you don't know if you're going to have that job next year. And it's difficult to hire those folks, and the folks that really excel in those roles, it's difficult to retain them for obvious reasons. Now, it doesn't mean that a new revenue stream would be completely invulnerable to some of those wins, but there's a case to be made that at least a significant share of that projected revenue, let's say even at just 1%, something like 38 million, would provide some level of fiscal certainty year over year, with some variability for sure, and maybe the possibility of a cataclysmic event like a pandemic that would require some new rulemaking and some new conditions. But to be able to rely on some revenue every single year that could go to Adam's point, very specific needs, a gardener in your neighborhood, some specific maintenance staff that would be there to actually pick up the trash on Monday morning, and that you could rely on it, is actually a mechanism that the Parks Department doesn't have today with the variability that it faces, every single year. Love to get a couple more hands, a couple more questions in there. I'm going to see hands up, excuse me. We'll go right here to the 1, 2, 3, 4th row, and then we'll head to the 6th row, and we may have maybe all the time we have today.
Thank you. I'm Susan Sharrow from Prospect Park Alliance. Thank you all for being here. I just wanted to, you brought up the Green Fund, Heather, and I just wanted to make the comment that the other challenge that we have, whether it's a conservancy or not, is there are really no private funders who are dedicated to parks and open green space funding solely. I think people would agree that we have to apply for certain programs. It's very hard to get private funding for the expense money, for maintenance, for the basic care that needs to happen in our parks. And so even when there is that nonprofit to support it, the private funding out there that we hope will be stepping up in the next few years is a real challenge for parks and open spaces. So I just wanted to make that comment as well.
Yeah, thank you. We'll go to the 7th row, and then I think we have time for one more. Yeah, hand it up right there. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name's Jose Garcia. I wear many hats. For the purposes of today, I'm representing New York City Runs, but disclaimer, my views do not represent my organization's views because I don't have the authority to speak on that. So I just wanted to point out that, I hear a lot of the comments about, the culture, library, library versus parks. It feels like a zero-sum game. But I also think that, we're looking at, revenue, but we're not looking at the possibility of the fact that we have, from a procurement in terms of staff that we could get tax credits for. For example, SIEP or CSEP people, right? You get tax credits for hiring those kinds of individuals. In the case of, the summer youth employment program or seasonal, or I think it's called seasonal, DYCD pays those salaries. And these are people that struggle to find work. AHRC has a whole campaign where you get the NYC Parks can get saved $2,000 of tax credit on the on the person's salary, and again they're struggling to find employment opportunities for these folks. And so if a big yes, we need to make revenue, but at the same time we've got a huge population that's native to New York, struggling to find work. Many of them have grown up in New York, can't get their first job. if the green fund, can kind of like say, hey, we can save money on labor by taking advantage of these tax credits or money that's coming from agency grants to give people work anyway, how different, maybe that will actually mitigate some of the costs to the point about stability, and then we may not need as much revenue. So instead of $38 million, because, personally speaking, I agree, I echo with some of the thoughts that some of the people were sharing about that 1%, that $1. The reality is 1 out of 8 New Yorkers is food insecure. They can only afford food or rent. They can't even afford a Broadway play. So when you take that into account, and the Bronx is still considered the poorest county in the country, it's not just New York City, it's the country. How the heck are we going to help, these folks to experience culture if we don't do something like that? And again, these are areas where folks want to, work. Nobody's hiring, or apparently don't want to hire because of the stigmas associated. And yet there's tax credits, tax benefits. Let's take advantage of that to save on money.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I think that it's a really good point. One of the things that happened last November is that there's a workforce program that was hiring the exact population you're talking about that was funded by a different agency from Parks, but Parks was benefiting from those workers. The administration cut that entire program, cut the funding for that entire program. Fortunately, through our advocacy, we were able to get some of that back, but we still lost 300 positions. So the issue isn't that we can't go out and find the people to do the jobs. The issue is that there's a hiring freeze. So we are not allowed, meaning the agency is not allowed to go and hire those positions. And having a hiring freeze for a year and a half or 2 years, you're seeing attrition in the agency. So when people leave, they cannot hire new people. So it's not about finding people or taking advantage in a positive way of workforce development programs. It's really just a complete elimination of the ability to hire.
Thanks, Adam.
That's what we're doing.
I think we have time for one last question. I'll go to the very back of the room. I see one more hand up. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nancy Gehrman. I'm just a private citizen. I have other hats that I wear, but I find this very fascinating. I'm just curious if Ronald can answer, because I'm not familiar with how the Parks Department works. You talk about sanitation. Why is it that New York City sanitation can't pitch in and maybe allocate some of their workers to the Parks Department to help clean up, or other departments that do similar work that have people that are trained to do those positions? Why can't those positions possibly be allocated to help the Parks Department?
Is anybody else? I'll just jump in. The cost of hiring a parks worker to do trash pickup is, percentage points of what it costs to hire a sanitation worker to do the same thing. It's fiscally not responsible, although they're doing very similar work. The parks employees across the board get paid less than their peers in other agencies. So if you want to build up the Parks Department and services in Parks Department, it doesn't make sense to go to sanitation to do that work. It doesn't make sense to go to the police department to bring police into our parks when there's a position, Parks Enforcement Patrol, that is already within the Parks Department that is 50% of the salary of a police worker, which is why we consistently say, you compare the budgets of these other agencies to what the budget for parks is, and it's embarrassing. It's pennies on the dollar to fund parks employees, and the impact is seen immediately when they are fully funded. Yep.
All right, thank you.
All right, great panel, right? A very big thank you to all of our panelists, and that was such an interesting and helpful discussion. I know that probably not everybody in the room agrees with every aspect of this proposal, but as Heather and so many other folks on the panel said, we try to start a conversation here, right? Like, we started not with, hey, let's saddle New Yorkers with a new fee, but we know we've got a problem funding our parks. And we, to Lucy's point and others, we have a problem funding culture and libraries and other things too. We think we see the tea leaves and we see what's happening in Washington. We're going to probably need new revenue streams. And this is one option. It's not the only option. And the idea that we put out there is not like the final proposal that has to happen. We wanted to start something, and it was such a good, refreshing conversation, and I appreciate all of you entertaining that with us. To Lucy and others, we would love to talk about how to make this successful as a partnership that potentially benefits a lot of the folks that need it. As you know, we write a lot about the importance of the arts, and we're working on new research, and so absolutely we're open to that, and we'd love to work with you about that. It's a great point. We appreciate you engaging with us on this, right? So there's a lot left to do, but it was such a helpful conversation. We appreciate you being here. Thanks to everybody that's tuning in online. Again, thanks to the Green Fund for making this happen, and have a great day.
Join us at the rally.
Yes, come rally.
Hey. He's like, I want to do this.